Okay, we're going live.
Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. We are going to take a couple of minutes to let people join the stream and then we are going to kick off. Hi, welcome if you've just joined today's webinar about authorization and authentication. We're going to wait for 1 more minute and then we will start today's webinar. Alrighty, let's get going. So welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cheryl. I am your host and moderator for today's event. Let's go to some housekeeping rules. So first of all, this webinar recording is going to be available on Permit's YouTube channel, and the link will be emailed to you if you signed up for the webinar. There's an open Q&A. Please post any questions you have either to the YouTube chat or to the community, the Slack community that's linked in the description below. We're going to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. If you have any other future topics that you'd like to hear about from us, then again, please come and join the community and we'd love to have you. And that's it in terms of housekeeping. So I have two fantastic speakers with me today. I'd like to welcome Or and Dan. So Or, would you like to start and introduce yourself?
My pleasure. Thank you, Cheryl. So my name is Or Weiss. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Permit. I started writing code at the age of 5, and then really my career took off as part of my work in the intelligence corps in the IDF. Worked at a couple startups, was a VP of R&D in a cybersecurity company, and created another DevTools company called Rookout. During my time at Rookout, I ended up rebuilding our access control 5 times when the company wasn't even 3 years old. That basically drove me insane. So I decided to start another company to solve that problem. And that's Permit.io. With Permit.io, you can get permissions for your product as you're building it without having to put any hassle. And more importantly, you can connect it to your authentication solution and enjoy great other products like FusionAuth that works seamlessly with it. So that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Or. Dan, great to have you. Would you like to say a few words for yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Cheryl. I'm Dan Moore. I'm head of DevRel at FusionAuth. I did not start coding at 5. However, I've been coding for about 20 years. I've been a CTO, AWS instructor, employee, a contractor, engineering manager. But in my most recent role at FusionAuth, I've been spending the last couple of years helping developers build and understand authentication better. So I am very thrilled to be here with Permit and talking about how authentication and authorization work together. So thanks for having me.
I am very excited that you're both here. A couple of words about myself. My name is Cheryl. I work at Apple as an engineering manager on the cloud infrastructure team. I've been in open source. I've worked for various other tech companies for quite a while, but my interests really are in Kubernetes, cloud native, developer-led growth, scalable infrastructure. So let's go to our next slide. And let's just start off by setting some context and starting some kind of introductory ideas. So Dan, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what is authentication?
Sure. So I love this slide because it really shows how all of these concepts work in tandem. But authentication is who you are. So it is a way for an online or offline system or entity to verify that the person or entity that is requesting usually some data in an online system, but it could be application access, it could be physical access. At some point, you have something that's being protected, and you need to have a way to verify that the person is who they say they are, so you can tell what level of access they should get. But upstream of that level of access is authenticating them, which is basically verifying that they are who they say they are. So that's kind of authentication in a nutshell. I could talk about it for a long time. There's different ways to do so, but I know we have other things to cover, so I'll hand it back to you.
I'm definitely looking forward to hearing a little bit more as we go through this webinar. Or what about the next step? What is authorization?
Thanks for asking. So authorization really steps in immediately after authentication. So once, as Dan said, you know who this identity is, you verify who they are, now you need to decide what are they allowed to do. I like to kind of picture this in a similar fashion to you walking into an office building. So authentication would be the bouncer or guard at the beginning of the building, just making sure people are coming in and checking in their identity cards or passports before they're allowed into the building itself. Once they go into the building, you are usually receive kind of a key fob or something else that you can use to walk between the different floors within that building. That would be the equivalent of the JSON web token that your authentication vendor can provide for you. That will represent your identity within the building, within the application. And then as you go between different floors, this key presenting your identity alongside the different doors and situations you come in will allow you or not allow you to interact with the room and its systems. So similarly, the authorization systems part of your product will allow or not allow different people to interact with those different parts in your system. And that in gist is authorization.
Nice. I like this bouncer metaphor. I can imagine the wristbands coming in. But let's focus on one particular part, because Dan, as you said, there were lots of different kind of contexts and environments. And today we're focusing on authentication and authorization within an on-prem security, privacy related environment. So why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges when it comes to building authentication within this kind of context?
Sure. So, there are all kinds of challenges around authentication in general, but I'm going to narrow it into that scope, which is it's really nice to have a little bit of constraint to foster some creativity. When you're in an on-prem environment, you might be there for a variety of reasons, and whatever reason that you're there is probably going to drive your authentication needs. So you could be in a situation where you have limited resources. For example, a kiosk or some hardware that is not like a typical server that you might find in the cloud or in a data center. And so in that case, you're really looking at an authentication server that can meet most of your functionality needs, but do so in a performant manner when operating under memory or CPU constraints. Another thing that we run into pretty often is network connectivity. And this is often applied for security reasons, right? You want to constrain who can make calls out, where they can make calls to, network requests. And in that situation, you are really fundamentally limited. You can't use most of the SaaS providers unless you're willing to write a really big check. And by on-prem, by the way, I should probably take a step back. In my mind, that means, that's a whole swath of computing environments. It could be in a data center, it could be in a private cloud, it could be in a public cloud that is something that's that you basically have limited access to, there are a lot of ways that you can consider on-prem. We prefer to kind of think of that as self-hosted in a lot of ways, because the real point is you're not using a SaaS provider, right? You're taking care of the whole process, whether that's for compliance, legal, or security reasons. So if you're in that kind of situation where network connectivity is an issue, you want to make sure that your auth provider works within that constraint. We have one client who actually, they are kind of a data company, and they sell into big companies who want their data analysis tool to run inside their data center for a number of reasons. The first is just cost, like it's aggregating a lot of data and it's moving a lot of data around. And so moving it to the vendor's data center would be a real hassle. And then also it's private proprietary data. And so they want to make sure that it stays within their security controls. In this case, the company's called Unsupervised. They actually deploy their software into Kubernetes clusters and other local environments. And they wanted to use FusionAuth to provide kind of a seamless authentication and integration experience. So a lot of these companies obviously have their own authentication identity providers, and Unsupervised didn't want to have their developers have to deal with integrating with each and every one of those. So the developers know how to deal with FusionAuth. FusionAuth knows how to delegate that identity protocol or delegate to those other identity servers. So that's a case where being on-prem was a really kind of required a unique set of capabilities that a self-hosted authentication provider such as FusionAuth can provide.
So do you often see this in the context of specific industries, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when you're in a regulated industry, or you're in an industry where you have a lot of legal requirements, like we see this with education, surprisingly, because politicians are not shy about protecting children's privacy. And we see this with financial services, where you want to meet a certain constraint like PCI. Those are kind of the main ones that we see. We've actually had conversations with US government about in FusionAuth, and they are looking for FedRAMP, which frankly, we're not sure that's a big lift. But yeah, so certain industries come in with certain requirements, and a lot of those requirements are really, hey, we need to have more control over this. We can't just use some random SaaS provider that someone put a credit card into, and we're not sure how they deal with their data.
I think that's pretty reasonable. That's pretty understandable.
Yeah.
Or why don't you tell us about authorization in such a on-prem constrained context?
Yeah. So I think when you're talking about authorization, first of all, there are similar aspects to authentication. That's especially when you're running on-prem or running in a mission-critical system, that performance element can be very critical. So a lot of times, if you're dependent on a third-party service, or if you're dependent on another cloud vendor, and for example, it is not as performant, or if there's latency, or if that service is for some reason not available or down, that essentially means your entire system is down. Because to perform any action, you first need to decide if you're allowed to perform that action. You need that authorization layer available. So with authorization, I really think the first part is the best practice of being able to decouple your policy and code and have that separate authorization component independent within your network. Ideally, I like to think of it as a microservice for authorization that you can run, and it can be independent of all the different services or third parties that you have in your system. It needs to be able to integrate with them, but it needs to run independently on the various locations, situations, and resource limitations that your system might meet. So just getting that microservice right is probably the first challenge, and in that aspect, it's kind of similar to authentication. It then moves to some additional complexities, most specifically around data and how you access it. with authorization, and especially if you're doing ABAC and not just plain old RBAC, if you're doing attribute-based access control, there's a lot of attributes, a lot of data that you need to expose into your authorization layer. Those might include sensitive elements like PIIs, PHIs, financial data, things that you might not be too excited about uploading to a third-party service or having a third-party service host them for you. So there, it's really important to find a way how you can load that data into your authorization layer without exposing it to third-party elements. And that's something that we've really put an emphasis on in Permit, and also with our open source, OPAL, which I think we'll talk about more later on. So to sum up, it's about building something that can meet your compliance needs, the performance, availability, and confidentiality, and enable you to integrate the data that you need without exposing it all over the place.
You mentioned.
Actually, Cheryl.
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Can I pop in real quick with the question?
Please.
Or should I wait for you? I'm sorry.
No,
you're in
Dan,
charge, Cheryl. Yeah, so one of the things that I've noticed is that authorization is way more intertwined with business logic than authentication is, right? Because again, back to your analogy about the bouncer and the hallways, like when you're inside the building, there's a lot more stuff going on as opposed to the bouncer who can just check IDs. So do you have any kind of feelings on that complexity as it relates to authorization in general or on-prem systems?
Yeah, I think it really connects to one of the points that I mentioned before. You want to be able to embed your authorization there. So authentication can really exist, both authentication and identity management, by the way. They can exist at the perimeter. They can exist outside of the target application itself. But in the end of the day, when you're building an application and it requires permissions or authorization, you have to bake those in. They can't be completely severed out. So now the question is, how do you connect them? You want it decoupled. You want it connected, but you don't want it too coupled in, because otherwise you're going to have a bad time every time you try to upgrade your service or upgrade your authorization layer. So that's why I always try and encourage with the best practice to decouple your policy and code and essentially have that policy run as an independent microservice in a component that can be easily embedded into the various situations that you might have. So you might want to embed it directly into a specific application. So there you want an SDK that can talk to that authorization microservice. You might want to embed it as part of your middleware, your GraphQL or your RESTful middleware. You might want to embed it as part of a service mesh, or as part of a reverse proxy that you have, or as part of an API gateway. So it's about building decoupled bridging components between your the different points for enforcement within your application, and that independent authorization component that no matter where you deploy it will meet those performance, latency, availability, and confidentiality aspects.
You briefly touched on RBAC and ABAC before, or why is ABAC more complex?
That's a terrific question. I love it because we're also launching our low-code ABAC support literally next week. In the end of the day, RBAC, role-based access control, it's the bread and butter of the permission space. Everyone ends up at least there, because you'll have a customer saying, I've used RBAC in a different application, so that's what I'm used to. Can you give me RBAC here? And the way RBAC works is that you assign roles to different users, and according to the role that you have, you get permissions, which is great. But that really covers a rather thin sliver of scenarios. Let's say you want a basic policy like only users that have paid for a feature can use it. So are you supposed to have a paying user role now? That's kind of odd. What about only users within the continental US should be able to access that part of the system? Or only users that have signed their GDPR can use this service in Europe? Or maybe, how about quotas? That's something very dynamic. Only users that are still within their monthly quota should be able to trigger that webhook or trigger that API. Those are basically impossible to describe as roles and are becoming very commonplace. In general, applications are becoming more and more complex by the minute. And these scenarios are not just becoming commonplace, they're becoming required by our business models, by the way we interact with our customers, and by the way our customers are thinking about working with our product. So if you don't have that, you're going to have a bad time and you're going to be lagging behind. So the question then translates into what's the easiest way that you can upgrade your permissions model? And one of the things we're trying to do around that is provide low-code ABAC. So you can plug it in, click a few boxes, and have it work without you having to write complex code, while always enabling you to do so if you want.
Nice. I look forward to seeing that when it's out there. Dan, Or mentioned a couple of the flows already between authentication and authorization. Do you want to expand or elaborate on any of these, like sign up, login, role translation, role assumption?
Sure. Yeah. So, it's actually really useful to think about kind of the whole user the account provisioning process, right? Which that goes from very beginning of account creation, which in a custom identity and access management system where people can kind of spontaneously sign up, that's usually happens via a registration process. And then obviously at that point, they are assigned to perhaps some roles, perhaps other ways of kind of giving them a granular or a coarse set of permissions. Then you have an authentication event where they try to log in and access things. You may have common self-service flows like updating a profile, forgetting a password, applying or setting up MFA as part of the authentication process. From there, you're obviously deeper into the application, and I'm going to kind of let Or talk about some of those. But at the end of the day, you also want to think about securely logging out, right? Making sure that access is revoked for a certain period of time if a user says, hey, I no longer need this application. And then there's the end state of deprovisioning the user, right? Sometimes accounts go idle, or someone hasn't paid, or for whatever reason, you need to make sure that you can clearly and easily remove those accounts too, so that if someone doesn't have access, the authentication system knows how to block them in an effective way. So again, there's kind of I gave you both sides of the piece of bread, and I think Or can probably give you the some of the meat and cheese in the sandwich.
Yeah, I'd love to add on that. So there's actually a lot potential points to cover between authentication and authorization, but to kind of simple it down a little, but to highlight I think the important connection points, I like to think about two kind of flows. I like to think of the sign up flow and ongoing kind of updates flow. With the sign up flow, the first time you create a user, the first time you meet that user and it's authenticated by the system, the first time you have an identity, it's a point where you can decide how you translate between these worlds. And I think what really excites me about authentication, its point as a kind of bridging component between identity management and authorization. And those two really reside in very different worlds. So identity management is usually on the customer side, in the organization, and you'll have concepts there like roles, but they will be very different. What's your role within the organization? Which department do you belong to? For example, this person is the VP of marketing. Now, as that piece of information is gathered from the identity management, usually through protocols like SAML and OpenID Connect, the authentication layer collects it, bundles it into a JSON web token, passes out to the application and specifically to the authorization layer. And because this is the first time we're meeting that user, that's what I'd call a sign-up flow. And now we have an opportunity to decide, how do we think about this user in an application perspective? Up till now, we only had claims about them as part of an organization, but now we need to kind of think, okay, this is a CMS system. So what does it mean to be a VP of marketing in this company in their CMS solution? So you have that option when the user first signs up to translate that into an authorization layer role or an attribute and store that either in a data source that you manage or within the authorization layer itself. The other flow is kind of ongoing. We really encourage people, as one of the best practices, to build authorization into their system in an event-driven fashion. Things are changing all the time. For example, with that example with billing that I gave before, only users that have paid for a feature may use that feature. That bit of information usually doesn't reside in your application or database. It resides in a third-party service like Stripe or Chargebee or whatever it may be. So you need that information to propagate in real time into your system and make those ongoing decisions about it. So if you build things in an event-driven fashion, and if your authorization layer is event-driven, aka it can receive updates to change its state, you can continuously update that. And that also works with authentication. Authentication can, and the best solutions like FusionAuth can provide webhooks for you as the new information comes in from your from the identity management of the customer, or when the user interacts with the authentication layer itself. So you can get that webhook and dynamically decide how you update your authorization layer. By the way, also with the sign-up flow, but here we're talking kind of an ongoing fashion. And that's kind of how I like to think about it. There are discrete points in time where you get events from your authentication layer, and you can translate them into your application or authorization level concepts.
Awesome. I actually really enjoy hearing both perspectives on it and how the meat and the cheese and the sandwich comes together. So we've had a bit of discussion about the general concepts around authentication and authorization. We've talked about how one ties in with the other, and we've talked a bit about the challenges within an on-prem environment where you have security and compliance requirements. So I'd like to dive a little bit deeper now into your actual individual products. And Dan, I want to start with you. So tell me a little bit about FusionAuth. What is it?
Sure, thanks. FusionAuth is an authentication, and we do offer RBAC. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on this webinar, but we're an authentication and authorization system. And we are basically built by devs for devs. Our founder was a dev. And what we do is we take some of the undifferentiated heavy lifting around authentication off of developers' plates. So we're a snap-in architectural component. No one's ever going to run FusionAuth just by itself. It's always going to be part of a bigger application, but we take care of a lot of the login flows. I mentioned some of them earlier, right? Forgot password, user profile editing, adding MFA, the actual authentication process itself, registration. These are all things that every application needs. Most every application. I can actually give you examples of applications that don't need them, but they're few and far between. And then but your users don't really care about them. I often say no one ever logs into something, visits a login page and says, oh man, this login page is so awesome, right? Your users want to get to the features behind the authentication. And so our job at FusionAuth is really to take undifferentiated, critical functionality, right? Because making sure that people authenticate correctly, making sure their data is taken care of, those are critical things. They're just not differentiating for most applications. So we take that off of developers' plates.
Definitely a critical part that perhaps probably almost every application needs. So how is FusionAuth different or similar to other providers like Auth0?
Yeah, I definitely want to give Auth0 props. They have done a great job of pushing this idea of identity provider as a service. It existed before them, but especially for dev-focused solutions, they really were a forerunner. We're a little bit different than them in that we have a more flexible deployment model. So with Auth0, you basically are hosting in their cloud. They do have on-prem solutions, but I think it's many dollars that you have to give them to get that. And we actually let you either self-host in an on-prem environment to, echo what we talked about a few minutes ago, or we will run it for you in our own secure public cloud offering, or you can actually move between them. And so this is something that's fairly unique. We actually see a lot of customers who start out either self-hosted for cost reasons, to be frank, right? Because you can control costs a little bit more if you're self-hosted, or they start out in SaaS because they just want to get going and they don't want to have to worry about operations, and then they switch. And it's your data. We're not going to hold it hostage. If you want to run FusionAuth locally and you're paying us right now for a cloud instance, we'll switch it out. So deployment model is one differentiator. Another is our developer focus, and that includes, who's not developer focused right now, right? But we actually try to live that in terms of our documentation, in terms of our marketing messaging and personas, and also in terms of our flexibility around deployment. So I kind of mentioned that you can self-host or not, but we actually run on all the major platforms, including kind of some weird ones like mainframes. If you want to run FusionAuth on a mainframe, go ahead. And and everything's API first, right? So we are entirely drivable. The entire FusionAuth application runs, there's a layer of separation. There's a front end that's a UI that calls our APIs, and then there's the API layer, and we expose 99% of those APIs. And so you can drive that via a number of different libraries. And if what we offer on our front end doesn't meet your needs, you can drop down to the APIs and write your own. And we have a lot of people who do that. And the third and last thing is we have lightweight logical tendency. So that means that it's very easy for you to bring FusionAuth into, say, a private labeled B2B SaaS, where you want the user groups to be disjoint, right? You don't want company A's users to be intermingled with company B's. You could, of course, run multiple FusionAuth instances, and get physical separation, but you can also run lightweight tenants inside FusionAuth with different look and feels for the login pages, different permissions, different even different like password rules or other configuration. So that's how I would say we're different from other competitors like Auth0.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a really great overview. And of course, anything that is developer focused, I love. So it's really good to hear that that's something that matters to you and you care about. Or I'm going to switch to you. So tell us a bit about Permit.io. What is it?
Sure. So Permit is a full stack permission solution. The basic premise behind it is that you as a developer won't have to never build permissions again. I've probably built access control and permissions thousands of times throughout my career, and at no point did I want to. And that's something that we empathetically understand. You don't want to do this crap. You want to focus on actually building your product. So we want to take this off for you. So just plug us off the shelf so you can focus on building your product itself. And we've built Permit on top of an open source layout. We've built it on top of OPA, Open Policy Agent, which we adopted and we contribute to. And we've taken OPA to the application layer with OPAL, Open Policy Administration layer, which is our own open source project that adds those event-driven and real-time aspects and that security architecture that we've kind of touched on, that ability to use data within a system without uploading it to the server side, essentially working in a zero trust, need-to-know basis kind of layout. So we've taken OPA, we've taken OPAL, and we've built Permit on top. So you have that open source foundation that you can trust, and you have those experiences on top that you can cater to your customers.
I'm always a big fan of open source as well. I mean, I love that you're building that on top of the open source. So what is the difference exactly between Permit and OPAL?
That's a great question. So OPAL itself and OPA are infrastructure components. They're generic components that you can plug into essentially anything. OPA is a general purpose decision engine. You can use it in Kubernetes. You can use it in your application. You can use it in an IoT device. You can use it just to, for example, do policy checks on your CI/CD deployments. That's called conf test, for example. But OPA itself is kind of really hard to use within the application layer. It's hard to manage a lot of instances of OPA, and it's hard to keep it up to date with the changes in the application layer. So that's where OPAL comes in. OPAL allows you to subscribe to different events through topics and make sure that all your OPA instances are kept up to date. But still, these two are just infrastructure and API solutions. When you're thinking about permissions And what you need to deliver in the end of the day, you're not thinking about APIs. You're thinking about experiences that both your people at the back office side and your customers need. You need things like user management with the ability to assign roles, API key management, secrets management, audit logs, the ability to see who did what within the system. So you want, as an admin, to be able to see across the entire system, and you want each of your tenants, each of your customers to be able to see what they did on their own within the system. Approval flows, invites, impersonation, the ability to view the system as if you're another user without actually logging in as that user. And this list just goes on and on. These experiences you've seen a billion times in a different billion applications. And every time you saw them, some poor schlep of a developer had to create them from scratch. And we're saying, maybe enough of that. Maybe we can have something off the shelf with the UIs, with the experiences themselves that you can embed. And again, focus on building your product. And that's where the difference between Permit and OPAL comes in. OPAL is still just an infrastructure component. Permit really takes you end to end.
I can see Dan is loving this. Let's not build it again. It's a schlep. Definitely, I can see Dan agreeing and nodding with this.
I love it because it's the same. We both saw big problems that developers were facing and want to take it off their plate. It's awesome.
So just a final one. So what is unique about Permit as a service?
So I'd say three things. One, and the most important one, is kind of that distinction that I put up front. Most of our solutions focus on just giving you infrastructure and API, and they go, you're a developer, you like to build things, right? So here, take an API and build those experiences yourself. You'll have a hell of a time because we've given you a lot of great technology. While I think that great technology is great, we at Permit think that's not enough. We really want to take you end to end. So again, you can focus on your product. The second part, and what really connects to this webinar, to this session, is the security and compliance aspect. With Permit, and thanks to the OPAL architecture, one of the things that you get out of the box is the ability to decouple your control plane and your data plane. Permit becomes your control plane, but the data plane and the enforcement components that you embed into your system, that microservice for authorization that I mentioned before, are all managed locally. All the data that you bring in is done directly into that source. So to explain, with OPAL, when you send an update on new data that you need, you don't set the data itself. You set instructions on where to get the data. So each microservice, each policy decision point can go and fetch the data that it needs without that data being uploaded to the cloud or to Permit or to anywhere else. And that really enables you to use this complex advanced solution with its experiences, but without giving up your security, compliance, or the sensitive information that you obviously care about. As a result of that, I'd say a significant percentage of our customers are in compliance-sensitive industries. So fintech companies, including banks, healthcare companies. I'd say healthcare companies are like almost a quarter of our customer pipeline. Thanks to that focus on permissions. And lastly, because I said it, three things, so the last one is about performance and availability. Thanks to that same model, because you run that microservice independently within your network, you don't need to go outside to a third-party cloud to query for authorization. Usually when you do that, you add a lot of latency, usually piling up to seconds, overhead for your application, and you're also becoming highly dependent on that third-party service. If it's down, you're down. With Permit, you don't have that problem because everything is managed in the background through that OPAL architecture. And independent of Permit's cloud service being up or not, your service and the microservices for authorization within it will always be up.
Fantastic. Thank you for that overview, Or and Dan both. I see we have a question that says, how does FusionAuth authentication solution interoperate with Permit? So this would be a perfect time for us to go to a demo. Show me the demo. And I believe we're going to hand over to Philip now.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be my pleasure to introduce you into how FusionAuth actually works with Permit. and how these two solutions integrate together quite nicely. Now, before I actually start the demo, I'd just like to point out to all the developers listening out there, like Or mentioned, and to highlight his point about security and compliance and how this application is run. I think from two perspectives here. From one, when I'm running this PDP, as we call it, the policy decision point on permit side, I'm actually running it as I'm doing this demo in the background. So it's all local to my environment. In the same way with FusionAuth, I have an instance running as well. That's local to my environment as well. So that's just a highlight. And without any further ado, I'm just going to jump right into the demo and try and explain how these two things work. One very important aspect of this is that we're going to look at how FusionAuth authentication syncs with permit, and where that handoff point within the application actually happens. So the point in which the user registers with FusionAuth, and then that same user gets synced into permit, so then we can have that control over our application. So let's just start with a simple sign in. Of course, let's assume that we don't have an account and we're a new user. So we're going to create a new user. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to call it test123@gmail.com. And we're going to log in. Now, because I'm logging in with a user that is generic, that user doesn't necessarily have any kind of association with, for example, FusionAuth or permit. And in that case, when I dive into the code later on, I'll show you how that works. But essentially, if we go into permit now, and I'll just refresh our service, so we were authenticated through FusionAuth, and now we can see that that user, which is actually defined as an ID. So when we create the user, we don't actually have to pass in any, secure information like Or mentioned previously. We can actually pass the specific ID that we get from FusionAuth and sync that user. Now, like I mentioned, because we're not associated to, for example, any of these two companies that I'm working with today, so Permit or FusionAuth, we've been given the role of a stranger as an instance of what we're allowed to do in the application. Now, if I jump back into what we can see, and actually, I'm just going to jump back into permit, and I'll go into our policy editor. I want to focus on three things so you understand how the application works a little better. We have three roles. We have an administrator role, we have a friend role, and we have a stranger role. And that's the role. The stranger role is what we've created when we just made our account. Now, with the stranger role, we have two actions that we can perform on a specific resource. We can view a GPG key and we can view a personal information, but this is not allowed for the stranger role. So in that case, if I actually try and learn more, I'm not allowed to do that. The permit has recognized this. It performed a permission check on this specific user, and it has come out to the conclusion that, I don't have those permissions. So in fact, I cannot do anything. So now let's take it a little further. Let's sign out and let's sign in again and create another account. But for this instance, I'm going to create a test account that has the email of FusionAuth.io. And let's register a new user. Now, if we actually go into permit again, and we go on the users, we can see that this new user has been created, but this time, because we used a recognizable domain, which I have configured in my code, I have been assigned the role of a friend. Now, the friend has more permissions in our system. The friend can actually view the personal information, but they cannot view the GPG key. And we'll be able to see that as I go back into the app. And if I click learn more, I can actually see more information about ourselves, about myself in this example. However, there is no option to view or copy a GPG key at all. So that permission has been restricted. Now, I want to kind of jump in and maybe talk about a specific handoff point within FusionAuth, because that's a very important aspect into how this all works. Now, if I actually, let me just refresh this page. I'm going to have to re-log in again. Okay, and if I just log into the admin panel of FusionAuth, and if I jump into our settings and look at the webhooks, what you'll notice is that actually if I just go on edit right here, that within FusionAuth, we have actually configured a webhook that listens for an event. And in this case, it listens for a user.create event. So anytime we create a user, this webhook will trigger and is going to handle this whole handoff point between FusionAuth and permit. Now, this handoff point is actually triggered upon the /sync user endpoint. But before I just jump right into it, I want to go back into my application. And I want to show you how adjusting policies within permit actually works and how quickly it works to adjust the content. So when we're checking for permissions within the system, we're checking and for permissions that, configure and change the way we see things on the front end, but also configure and give us permissions on the things that we can do within the backend. So because I'm currently logged in as this FusionAuth user, that's currently a role of a friend. If I go into our friend role and I give myself permissions to view the GPG key, and in that case also copy the GPG key, if I click on learn more, what you'll see is that now within this UI, the actual UI has changed depending on the permissions that we did. And also I'm able to copy that key because that is another permission check that happens in the backend. So with giving you this demo, now I want to jump into a very quick code overview of what's going on, and I'll explain and refer back to all the things that you have seen here. And in return, that should give you a much better understanding of how these two systems work. So first of all, I want to discuss this whole handoff point that I talked to you previously, where we essentially hit that specific endpoint, which was the sync user endpoint upon that webhook event of the user being created. And within this webhook event, we're actually, what we see here is that we are creating a basic role for a user, which is a stranger. And then we're having a check saying that if we are part of FusionAuth or if we are part of permit, in that instance, we get applied a friend role. And then we use the permit SDK, where we call the sync user function, where we pass in our ID that identifies our user specifically. In this case, I passed in an email, and I also passed in the role depending on the user that we have. So that's how this the whole syncing of the user works. And this is the important aspect, to always have the same user be represented on both FusionAuth and also permit. Now, actually speaking about permissions, and for example, we have certain permissions where we wanted to learn more. So learn more was one of the first options that we could do on that profile that I have showed you. And now, as part of the learn more, we have two permission checks. Now, a permission check is a function that essentially, in this case, takes a specific action that we've defined within a permit, so view personal information, and a card, so the resource that we're performing that action on. So when I clicked learn more, the first permission check that I wanted to do was actually to check if I can view that personal information on the card. And whether I pass it or not, let's assume that I have those permissions within permit, then I go on to the second permission check, whether it is me being able to view the GPG key and perform that action of viewing that GPG key on the card resource. And of course, this gives us the whole permission. This comes up with a result, and hence we can either view that key or not. And the last thing I kind of want to touch on as part of this demo, when I was talking about showing and giving permissions, and permissions that not only work on the back end, but also work on the front end. So in the same way, when we were, for example, let me just find it right here in the code. When we're copying the GPG key, for example, I have a permission and a permission check that hits this endpoint called get GPG key, which actually checks for that permission, again, runs a permit check on the backend, whether with that specific user ID that I'm currently logged in as, that we have taken from FusionAuth, to be able to see if I can view that GPG key or not. So both permissions perform on both sides. And of course, if I just go back to the demo, And of course, those permissions can be applied and taken away very simply by very easily just changing those permissions within permit. And of course, if I remove those permissions and I try and learn more, those permissions are instantly taken away. So I think I'll wrap up the demo here, and I will pass it back to our moderator to continue with any further questions that anyone may have.
Oh, this is so cool. Thank you so much for showing us, Philip. It looks actually very, very straightforward, very simple, not a lot of touch points, which is a really nice sign of like a nice clean separation. We do have some questions from our audience. So the first one, I'm going to direct this to Or. So how does the IAM waterfall apply to authorization / permissions from coarse to fine-grained? For example, at the app level, the endpoint level, and an API, and then an attribute level.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I think we kind of touched on some of it. So when you think about the IAM waterfall, you need to think about how things propagate between the different layers and what each layer is responsible for. So usually the first part is your identity management, and that's on your customer side. It's their identity management where they're managing their users. You don't have a lot of control there, but you might be able to ask them to have a contract with you. Sometimes that's feasible. You can ask them, I want you to store these attributes as part of the profile for the users that you connect to our system. By the way, it's not something that I recommend because that can break easily, because that's on each of your customer side. You need to have a contract between their identity management and your application. But it is feasible, and sometimes customers actually want that because they want to drive a lot of things from their identity management. So that's the identity management part. And then we're moving from the customer side to the vendor side, if you're a developer, to your side. Then the first step is obviously authentication. In the authentication side, you'll often find role management solutions. So FusionAuth, as Dan mentioned, as RBAC, it has roles. So you can already, as part of your authentication layer, start to build the profiles of the users that you import into your application. That can also be a point where you do some translation, where you take things from the identity management and according to a contract or according to a logic, you translate them into the structures and roles or other models that you have within your authentication solution. And those then eventually, it almost doesn't matter which authentication solution you use today. All of those, when you come into the application, would almost definitely be translated into a JSON Web Token. A JSON Web Token is a cryptographically signed JSON document. It has different attributes, and it has a signature that verifies the validity of the entire thing. Those different attributes that we got from the identity management up the waterfall, and then maybe from the authentication solution. By the way, some authentication solutions allow you to run code on their layer itself, or to obviously use their API to add more things on the layer itself. And so you can build and collect different attributes from the identity management, from the authentication, and finally bring them within that JSON Web Token into the application itself. Now, within the application, within the authorization layer, it's up to you to first make sure that everything that has come up till this point matches the structures that you're going to use as part of your policy. Your policy can always look directly at the claims within the JSON Web Token, and sometimes the scopes, but I won't go into that. But you need to make sure that those are consistent. And that really connects to the point that I've mentioned before. You have two primary models for handoff. You either, at the sign up, the first time you see the user, you do a translation, either in the authentication side or the authorization side, and you make sure that the attributes that you have are going to match the application itself and its policy. Or you can do this ongoing. You can have those different layers propagate continuously into your authorization layer as data, but still you need to do that translation. In the end of the day, you have a set of attributes in 3 different levels. You have the attributes about the identity, which can be all those claims that we mentioned before. You have attributes about the system itself and the different resources on it. I like to think of those as, so I like to think of a system as a set of resources and actions you can perform on. And those resources, aside of just being resources, can also have additional attributes. And lastly, you have general context of what's going on in the world. For example, a classic example of that is time. Maybe this application should be used after working hours, just as an example. So all of those end up propagating into documents within your policy decision point, within that microservice for authorization. It's up to you as a developer to find a way to bring all of that data consistently there. One option, if you're doing open source, is to use OPAL. If you're looking for an end-to-end service, that would be Permit. And you can also, if you stick to these best practices, you can also try and build this on your own. But in the end of the day, you'll have to propagate all those things across the waterfall and bring them into the agent with the policy that they can make the right decisions at the right point in time.
Dan, do you want to comment on anything in there? Expand?
No, I think that was a really great kind of summation. And I think the only thing I would say is this points to how complicated it can be. And I think Or was very charitable in saying you could build it yourself. People often come up to us and say, like, well, I could build FusionAuth in, I don't know, a couple of months. And we think about how much time and effort and edge cases we've encountered across hundreds of customers. And I'm sure the same is true with OPAL and Permit. So, and again, do you really want to be, right? Like, do you want to do that schlep or do you not? And that's really all I have to say.
Awesome. We've got another comment here. Well, we've got someone who says, thank you. That was a very nice illustration of the interplay between authentication, authorization. Super helpful to think of Permit as a control plane for access controls and a control plane that goes beyond Kubernetes. So I know both these solutions, we're talking about this in the context of running it on-prem, or you mentioned earlier that best practice is to run this within a microservices architecture. So do you have any thoughts, comments on integration of Kubernetes, or if a company is not ready to move to Kubernetes yet, what they should do?
Yeah, so first of all, with Permit, you can run this wherever. You can run this on a single monolithic machine running in your back room in your apartment, and you can run this on your most advanced Kubernetes cluster running on your top-notch cloud. It doesn't matter. It's just a container and an SDK. You can embed this wherever you want. But I think the question kind of hints on the different levels that you need both authentication and authorization for. There's an entire stack. So it starts with like physical level access control, like who can come into this office. Like we put locks on the doors on purpose, and some of those locks are smart, like an August lock or something like that. And then you move to network level access control, firewalls, and zero trust networks, VPNs. Then you move to infrastructure level access control. So within a Kubernetes, which service is allowed to talk to which service, which containers or services are allowed to be admitted into various clusters or pod within your system. And then you kind of go into application level access control, which is kind of ad infinitum, a variety of snowflakes, different logics that you can have. And because you don't have the luxury of doing only one, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So you need to secure everything, monitor and audit everything. So if you stick to the best practices and you use an authentication solution that is battle tested and can verify various identities from wherever they're coming, and if you're doing policy as code, which you can manage with the best practices like GitOps and doing code reviews and managing it, which is, by the way, Permit generates code for you, pushes it into a Git repository for you to manage. So if you stick to those best practices and you decouple your policy and code and you build everything with across the system with those best practices and battle-tested tools, you're going to have a much easier time applying this across the stack, managing this in a unified way, and making sure you're not going to make silly mistakes that you're going to regret later, which can also result in security incidents, which are, as you can see with recent events constantly, like if we look currently on the watch, it says Uber. But like I'll look at the watch a couple hours later and say a different name of a company. So these are constantly going in. We need better tools to manage all of this complexity. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're getting towards the end of our session. So just to wrap up and summarize what we've talked about, and then Dan and Or, I'll ask you for last thoughts. We talked today about authentication, authorization, different common flows that work between the two, some of the challenges that you face implementing these within on-prem or constrained environments. We had a look at the different products, and Philip showed us a demo of how the two can work together. So just to finalize, Dan, last thoughts from you?
Sure. As developers, we hate to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes we want to understand the wheel. And I hope that this presentation has helped you understand some of the complexities and intricacies of authentication and authorization. So that's it.
Or any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think I really connect to what Dan said. We really try to make this as accessible for everyone. And but this might not be enough. So if you have more questions, more thoughts, you want to just spin up cool ideas with us, feel free to reach out. You can schedule a call with us through Calendly on our website. You can join our Slack community. Just shoot us questions there. I'm really easygoing, and I always love to talk to fellow engineers and security practitioners. So I look forward to chatting with all you all.
I've very much enjoyed chatting to you all today as part of this webinar. Those slides that we saw earlier are going to go out to our listeners if you've signed up for the webinar link. Aside from that, I'd like to thank all three of you for your time today, and I will hope to see you again next time. Take care.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.